often their first question will be, was that right? And in your heart, you want to say, well, what a ridiculous question. You say, was that coaching session right? But in a way, our systems have prepared us for that, and our sporting culture prepares us to think about it in that way as well, that almost there is a right way to do it. Our coach education systems across the sports for years has sort of said, if you do it this way, you will pass, for example, or you will get through. Or if you replicate this practice, then you will be the next level, or you will be a better coach if you do it like person X, etc. And I think that actually that's fundamentally unhelpful in trying to learn about sort of educationally informed processes and programs.
Welcome, this is the Liverpool FA podcast. Our aim is to provide regular insight from a variety of experts to help you in your own grassroots football journey. We'll do this through interviews, roundtable discussions, and by linking to other resources to help support you. For more information about each episode, just tap the album art, which will provide you with more about our guests and links to further content.
Our guests today are Dr. Andy Cale and Dr. Don Vinson from Worcester University. Andy is a UEFA Pro licence holder. He has a PhD in Sports Psychology from Loughborough University and previously Head of Player Development at the FA. Don is a Senior Fellow of the Higher Education Authority and is also on the England Under-16 hockey coaching staff. In this episode, we have a real in-depth conversation on a load of topics, including philosophy and practice, coaching values, beliefs, moral dilemmas, and the impact of culture and context on coaching behaviours. It was an absolute pleasure. Don and Andy are so articulate, and to be honest, it was a challenge to keep up with the depth of conversation at times. Took a while to get warmed up, but once we got going, we got into some real great discussion. I hope you enjoy. Dr. Don Vinson, Dr. Andy Cale, welcome to the show. Thanks for inviting me down to Worcester University today. Ever since the idea of the podcast came about, I've been really wanting to get you two both on. And for those listening in, Don and Andy have been tutoring a group of our team in the grassroots department on a postgrad course since last summer. And I've had a huge impact on the way that we think and deliver. Gents, we'll get into your coaching CVs as we go, but for now, if you could give us a brief summary of what your work entails at the university. So Andy, I don't know if you want to go first.
I'm relatively new to the university, been here 3 years now in total, and I'm currently course leader on the sports coaching degree pathway. Work with Don on postgraduate and master's level work. We both try and engage with governing bodies in terms of coach learning, coach education, and how to help coaches develop and how to help governing bodies develop their coaches.
So my work is not dissimilar to Andy's. I lead the master's degree, the postgraduate stuff in sports coaching, which, as Andy suggests, sort of involves just helping, if you like, the slightly older or more mature coaches develop their practice. And also my sort of other role within the department is I'm trying to help our group of staff develop their research culture and trying to help them to be more confident about inquiring and writing about their experiences.
Yeah, and that inquiring I can certainly vouch for, because we met for the first time last summer when our course started, Don, and that's the first time I come across you, and you definitely had a profound effect on my own critical thinking and got me to look at things in a different way. So thank you for that. Andy, I'm still licking my wounds from the sound beating that you gave me on the golf course yesterday. So I wanted to get my own back. Last night I challenged you to place where we first met. Did you manage to remember?
No, and I didn't cheat. I didn't go and look at any resources. I didn't phone a friend or anybody. No, so go on, you'll have to tell me.
So believe it or not, I probably wouldn't be sat here right now talking to you guys if we hadn't met. I believe it was 2006, Cale University, FA Psychology for Soccer Level 3. And at one stage, you had us playing a full 11-a-side game with an imaginary ball. I don't know if you remember that.
I had to play a lot of 11-a-side imaginary football because I wasn't particularly good, so I did use it as a technique quite a lot. Oh, that's fantastic. That whole process of trying to introduce psychology into coaches and via different courses was an exciting time, and it's gone very well. So I'm glad it had some effect. I'm glad to see it's made you perfectly sane and philosophically sound.
I think the topic was visualization, actually, but I remember sat in the room. I think it might have been on the last day of the course, thinking that's the sort of work that I'd love to get into. It seems like I was a fresh graduate out of university, and it definitely inspired me to go on and do more. So thanks for that. I'd like to we're going to spend most of the episode talking around coaching philosophy and practice, but before we dive into that, I'd like to get into your history, your coaching history. So if you wouldn't mind giving us a kind of run through of where you started and your journey through coaching to where you are now, Don.
Well, yeah, very briefly. I went to university to study PE and sports science and maths. We don't talk about the latter too much. But I went to be a PE teacher and realised fairly quickly that that's not what I wanted to do, and sort of got a real passion for coaching there, and did the very typical thing of just collecting a whole suite of coaching awards in various sports, mainly in the invasion games, but in some other things as well. But also in my main sport. My main sport is field hockey, and I played and coached that, and really that was the only coaching then that I did for most of my playing career. Just bits and pieces here and there, working with some kids, some summer camps, doing a bit at club, coaching some university teams, and really that was my it was a bit potted really all the way through my playing career, just doing bits and pieces. And then I did my Coach Ed awards as I was going through that, but then I don't think I considered myself to have really started coaching until I retired. I retired from playing 29 early in order to coach, because I'd known for a long time this was going to be the thing that I was passionate about. Actually, I thought I thought I was going to be a better coach than I was a player, so I was keen to get into coaching. So retired from playing, had an opportunity to coach a good ladies team, so I thought this is it for me, and then really invested in that for a number of years. And a few years ago, we might talk about this a little bit later, England Hockey changed their way of thinking and their coach education system, but also their junior pathway performance system. And up until that point, to be honest, I'd kind of kept it at arm's length, because I didn't really buy into the old way of doing things. It didn't really either appeal to me. I just couldn't. I didn't want anything to do with it, to be honest. But then it changed, and I thought, actually, this is a really good change for the better. And I jumped into doing some coach education. So I've been doing that, just little bits and pieces again for a few years, and have greatly enjoyed and benefited from being involved with that. And then just last summer, I finished my club coaching commitment then, and was looking for a next opportunity, and got a position with our under 16 England girls team, assistant coaching in that pathway. So I've been doing that for the last year or so. Learnt a great deal from that experience.
Brilliant. If I can just jump on a couple of those points that you make there, Don. Obviously, women's hockey in this country is heavily in the spotlight at the moment.
Yeah. All
down to you, I'm sure.
Absolutely nothing to do with me.
And you mentioned about collecting awards, and it's something that I know I certainly experienced when I was started coaching, that I felt that the only way I was going to acquire any knowledge was through the medium of a formal qualification. Similar process for yourself?
I don't know if I gave it that much credit, to be honest. Perhaps I was a bit of a cynic, but I think the culture of our perhaps it was our undergraduate course, but I think this was fairly typical. It was almost, well, just collect as many as you can. It was like stamp collecting more than actually acquiring knowledge. It was just get the piece of paper. And I can't remember thinking at the time, anything was particularly mind-altering, beneficial, to be honest. So did probably 6, 7, 8 level 1 coaching awards in various things. I can't remember having a particularly positive view of them, I'm afraid, at that point. So I guess in terms of, I'm struggling to think how at that time I thought I was going to learn as a coach. I don't think it was through that mechanism, but perhaps I just thought it was going to be through being coached by better and better people. So I was still at that stage, thinking this is my early 20s, pursuing my career as a player and looking at the sort of the better clubs in the country and thinking, how can I get into them? I guess I thought if I can go there, play there, be coached by some good people, perhaps that's how I'll learn how to coach. I think... but also, early 20s, I probably didn't think about it that much either, to be honest. I was still very much focused on, trying to learn how to hit the ball in a straight line. That was...
Places, what time frame were we? So it's early 20s, rough, at the risk of giving your age away here. Yeah, what year are we looking at?
So I was an undergrad 1998 to 2001. And then I've sort of continued in education, did my postgrad stuff 2001, 2004. So then I got my first lecturing job in sport 2004. So I've been doing this for 13 years or so.
And the reason I ask is I was a few years behind you, but I felt in the same way it was this badge collecting.
Yeah.
So actually I felt that I probably missed out on a big impact of, for example, going in on the level 3, 4, 5 psych for soccer with Andy and his colleagues, because I was just in a rush to enhance the CV. And I wish I could go back now and almost turn back the clock and approach it in a different way.
I think it's probably the nature of the awards, though, as well, at that time, was we will teach you a bit about the sport. And so this is no fault of the coach educators who were, for example, delivering the level 1 rugby league qualification that I did. I've never played a game of rugby league in my life, but I've got a level 1 coaching award. Because, and I guess I learnt perhaps a little bit how to teach tackling. Did that in the level 1 coaching award. All the controversy around that at the moment, I'm not sure that I would. But I guess that was the stock expectation of those courses. We're going to learn a little bit about the sport, enough perhaps to run a couple of sessions and to say, on your PE interview, if we're going for a PE teacher's job, I can deliver 6 weeks on rugby league or something like that. And I guess you probably could, replicating the kind of materials that you've been given in that sense, but genuinely learning about coaching and the heart of it, that wasn't what they were about, and so that's not what we got.
No, and that's really one of the founding reasons why we wanted to get this podcast out there, because I certainly felt when I started my journey that the only way I was going to acquire knowledge would be from those formal courses, from those educators. And I remember actually moving clubs when I was about 22. I was living where I grew up on the Isle of Man after finishing university, and I actually moved from my boyhood club to another club because the coach had an A licence, and I wanted to learn just by osmosis, if you like.
Yeah. And I think we'll go on to talk about this because it's something I'm passionate about as well. In sport, we have, I think, a number of barriers for learning sometimes, and some of those are we place a very high degree on the quality of a performer in terms of their status in the game. To the extent that, and this is across loads of sports, we assume that the best players will make the best coaches, and I'm quite strongly believe that often isn't the case. But also, I think we also, perhaps when we're beginning our coaching in those early 20s and we haven't established our reputation or a track record of coaching as yet, almost the only thing we've got to fall back on then is in terms of our credibility and identity is, well, how good a player were you? And so it's kind of natural, I guess, in sport. I also think we tend to look at those in positions of power or authority or in high level positions and think, oh, they must be doing it right. They must know so much more than everybody else because they're coaching this club or they've got this role with the national governing body. And I guess that's natural as well. But I think part of my, the core of my philosophy is trying to challenge those perceptions of capability, competence solely on the basis of either a playing history or a position of power. I think there is so much more to learning about, in our case, coaching than that.
Thanks, Dan. Andy, there's plenty more points that I want to pick up on there, but Andy, you've been sat there nice and patiently tracking back through your coaching CV archive, I'm sure. So talk us through where it started for you and the journey to where you are now with your coaching.
It helped Don going first because it triggered my memory. Had have been no good first. Very similar to Don in some senses, in that I went to Loughborough University, and part of that experience then, I didn't know I wanted to coach, but I knew I was fascinated by, then, my main sport of football, and in general, coaching and psychology. Those were my sort of interests and passions. So went to Loughborough around 1981, and it was a high performing environment, and there was something about the culture there that has probably impacted on me and others significantly, and I didn't realise it at the time, and that's why I'm careful with my words now, thinking back. My coaching started, I was an okay performer, good university, but in football terms, university players, it was pitched almost at semi-professional level. So I was able to play Great Britain students, went to some World Student Games, and I was coached by some really, really talented coaches, governing body appointed coaches, top coaches at the time. And I was amazed how different their approach to coaching was compared to some of the semi-professional and non-league coaches I'd had. And so around 19, 20, 21 as a player, I'm playing for different types of coaches, and it got me fascinated about, well, is there one way to coach then, or what's the best way to coach? And so that got me stimulated in terms of coaching. Like Don, I somehow collected tennis and squash and rugby league before football in terms of formal coach education awards, but it was a bit more pragmatic. I needed some money. I needed to work in the summers. I needed to work at the Easters, and I thought if I had a couple of badges, it would make me employable. And to this day, the most lucrative coaching experience has been teaching tennis in terms of hourly paid, and but I realised I didn't want to teach tennis. But that was my most fantastic investment in a sport coaching process. So I was starting. I wasn't collecting governing body awards. I was just drawn to, I wonder how different sports teach their coaches, because it doesn't seem to be consistent. So when I was 20, 21, 22, I've experienced those different sports as how do those sports teach coaches, what's important to those sports and what's important about the sport. And then still at Loughborough, I completed my Masters, completed my PhD, and that's 2 short sentences to sort of cover 5-6 years of work. During that 5 or 6 years, I was able to I became too old then to play in the World Student Games. There was an age limit at the time, but I then transitioned, if you like, from being a player and captain to assistant coach. So I became assistant coach to 2 Great Britain squads, one in Buffalo in America, and one in Sheffield. And then I was fortunate enough, because I'd been assistant, it was almost like the coaches moved on. I was in a good place, having been a player, to become the head coach. And that was both the best and worst experiences of my life, because I took a Great Britain team to a student games and managed to comfortably lose every game. Yet we had a great time, great camaraderie, but the opposition were just too good. And then it started to dawn on me that actually being a good coach is not just about winning, it must be about other things. But I had to think that because I'd lost every game. and I was trying to justify myself. Am I really that bad a coach? So assistant coach, head coach, and then around that time, because of my psychology background, I'd started to work with the governing body in terms of introducing psychology formally into coach education, whether that be as part of awards or subsidiary courses. Went on to sort of manage non-league in Wales, went into winning domestically championships year after year with a very successful team. In Europe then for 5 or 6 years, Champions League, and I suppose the pinnacle of coaching career was playing Liverpool at Anfield in the qualifying round to Champions League. And again, just being careful not to be too embarrassed as a coach, to make sure that we were organised and did the well as we could. So in terms of coaching history, varied, non-league, British students, and then fortunately when I went to the FA full-time, I was also appointed as assistant coach to various age group teams in my tenure there. So I was assistant to the under-15s, under-16s, under-17s, under-18s, under-19s, under-20s at various stages in the career. And again, fortunate about learning with some of the top coaches, learning from some of the top players in terms of what did they need. And so my coaching has been very sheltered in some senses, in that I've never really taught children, and I've only really taught adults in a professional setting who were already quite competent, but fascinated about how to get the best out of individuals and merge them as a team and team development.
I want to pick up on something that you said at the beginning there, Andy, where you said you didn't know that you wanted to be a coach. Was there a moment when that realisation came true? No one moment, but I think during my time at Loughborough, when I talked about that culture, you're surrounded by really competent athletes, top class Olympians. And once you start to see what being an elite athlete means on a daily basis, it started me to think, well, what do they need as athletes to be better? And I saw then a whole range of different sports treating those elite athletes in different ways that was very successful. And I always then had the question, how would that translate into football? Some of my friends were Olympians, both in team sports and individual sports. Some had minimal contact with a coach, but that was what they needed. Some had masses of contact with their coach because that's what they needed. So all of a sudden, individual difference started to jump out at me. And then how do you cope with individual difference in a team sport like football or indeed hockey on a daily basis, where actually all the individuals need something different that suits them? How was a coach meant to know that? I related back to my governing body stuff at the time across all of the sports. None of the formal coach education courses had told me about that. So it was a matter of, they were teaching me about the game, the tactics, the technique, which was great because I needed that information. But by watching performers and watching the coaches in that Loughborough environment, where it was a multi-sport environment, I realised that successful and effective coaching could look many, many different things. So it was around that period. So by the time I left with my doctorate, with my then A licence, and fortunately went into work at Sheffield United, I was just fascinated then by how did good coaches interact and affect good players. And picking up on something else that you said initially, I think it was, you mentioned you were being coached by a number of different coaches, and some of them were NGB level coaches and some of them were local level coaches. You mentioned there was a difference. One group were, I think you said they were great coaches as compared to good coaches. What would be some of the things that made those great coaches stand out when you were coming through as a player? Again, I think all coaches are shaped by the environments through which they've been in. So these comments are in the context of, I've been at Loughborough doing a PE and sports science degree, got into my coaching, and was inquisitive and wanted always to know why. Why are we doing something? Why are we doing that practice? Why are we playing like this? Therefore, for me, great coaches were those coaches who could articulate that, explain that, and justify, well, we're doing this because. So some of the great coaches I talked about then were Les Reed,
who went on to the FA and now at Southampton, and Ted Powell, who's unfortunately now passed away. But they were fantastic educationalists. They were teacher trained. They'd done a lot of teaching. They understood children. They understood adults. Their arts of communication were first class. And there was a respect because they were trying to help you. And from the very earliest days, you felt they're in this for the athletes. Some other coaches that I'd been with were genuinely there to win. They were honest people, trying their hardest, but what was important to them was winning a game because their job depended on it. But they were less interested in you as an individual. So it's that subtlety of what was driving those different people as coaches, what was their background, what were their motivations. For me, some of the great coaches were those who cared about people, could justify what they were doing in an intelligent way.
You mentioned, I think you said wonder and curiosity, and I always look out for the players that I work with. You know, certainly the kids that I'm fortunate enough to coach. I love the curiosity that they have, and they want to know why that we're doing what we're doing. And I know some coaches might take offence to that. Well, why am I being questioned? But actually, I see that as a real strength in a player, and also a real strength in a coach if they're curious about what's possible and why, and that, like you say, having that justification for doing what they're doing. I want to shift on a little bit, Don, and bring you in here. We're going to get into the kind of bulk of what this episode is about, which is around philosophy or coaching philosophy. So what do you make of the term coaching philosophy?
I think it's a term we've used for quite a long time, and I think what it was originally intended to capture was if you like, something about a rationale, something where coaches were encouraged to think, well, what do I believe? What are perhaps some of my core values, and why do I do practically, or why do I coach in the way that I do? And I think that was when the term was originally coined. I think that's what it was intended to do, and I think probably for most of its life and usage, that's what most people meant, essentially. A general values, beliefs, foundation of why we do what we do, and there's been some recent discussion about whether this is a good term, because I guess those things are not really philosophy in an academic sense. They're not philosophy, but I don't know. To be honest, I don't care. Actually, I think the heart of it was right. It's just thinking about why do people do what they do, and to think deeply about that, and to think that that's important.
Don, I think when I was younger, 21, 22, and first coaching, I never thought about a coaching philosophy. I have to say, I was just still wrapped up with trying to understand the game or the games of different sports. So this almost higher level beliefs and values, I wasn't ready for that at 21, 22, 23. In fact, that didn't kick on to me till much later. So the term philosophy might have scared me as an early coach. However, once I became a bit more experienced, I just think you need something to be consistent from. Now, whether I would use the word philosophy, I probably prefer those beliefs, values, things that you respect and value and trust. I think those are easier concepts for coaches to understand. I don't know what your view is.
Yeah, no, I would simply boil it down. Why do you do what you do? And I'm not actually sure we need to go too much further than that. You can elaborate a little bit if you like, but that's the heart of it, just to challenge people. I think perhaps I was a little bit different from you, Andy, in that I was right from the outset really challenged to think about that question. Why do we do this in a particular way? And I might not have used the term philosophy, but I would have certainly used that the same kind of processes to think about it. Essentially, why do I want to do this? What's the foundation of it? What's my real core heart for why I'm doing it like this? And I could think perhaps a couple of things that really impacted me there from say quite a young age as somebody learning. I can remember being a middle school pupil turning up to hockey practice in the middle of rural Suffolk, where there were no great facilities. It was just, a rather bumpy grass pitch, etc. And I was the only one who turned up for practice that day. And the teacher there was a lady named Rebecca Savage, and she took me out and we did a one-on-one practice. And that stuck with me right at the instant, thinking, because I was expecting, as I was sat in the changing room on my own, for practice to be cancelled, and that's rubbish, isn't it? Because I want to go and play hockey. But she took me out anyway, and that stuck with me then, thinking this is great individual commitment from a teacher to a pupil to go and do that. And then just another instance, when I first walked through the door of university day one, I hadn't been to open day or anything like that. I walked through the door for the very first time, and a chap called Mick Moore, who was my course leader, shook me by the hand and said, "Hi, you must be Don." I was like, I had no idea who he knew, and he then went on to say how impressed he was with my application, and hadn't I done well in my A-levels, and he clearly knew what A-levels I'd done and my profile, and that I was a hockey player essentially, without ever having met me or known me or anything other than my application before. And those two instances just really drove home in me, right from quite an early coaching age, how important it was to care about the individual and to know as much as you can about the individual, and how impactful that can be if you really get that right and in an authentic way. So little episodes like that influenced my coaching practice right from the outset, to say, this is the kind of coach I want to be. This is a core foundation belief value, if you like. Know the individual, care about the individual, because it's the right thing to do, but also because that's how you get genuine engagement and enthusiasm from the people that you coach.
15 or 16 years ago, when I first started on a pro license course, we were asked to write down our coaching philosophy. What was it? How is it shaped? And I found it a really difficult thing to do. So I was then, relatively experienced and relatively older. And it then made me think, and it made me think about two things. It made me think about some of the coaches that were very educational in nature, and it made me think of the coaches that were very winning in nature. And my challenge was, I thought I was both. I had a genuine belief that I wanted to educate players, help them, support them, but I equally had a real competitive drive to win. So when I was trying to write down what is my coaching philosophy, I sometimes found myself shifting or merging or blending those two aspects, which are often placed in a continuum, but I'm not sure that that's the case. I think you can be both. You can be a real winning coach with a strong educational philosophy about developing people. The problem for different sports is the timelines are so different. So current professional football managers and coaches have to be successful quite quickly. If you said, what's your philosophy to those coaches, they would say, I've got a real strong educational philosophy, but if I don't win, I haven't got a job tomorrow. So the practical application of where does this beliefs, values, understanding of yourself as a coach, depending on where you're coaching, can be very different. I think it's very easy for a teacher who might be teaching every day and coaching as a hobby to have a genuine educational philosophy, and it does not matter whether they win or lose, and it's easy for that type of person, coach, to stick 100% to their personal values of education and support for people. For other coaches who are in a business, the delicacy becomes, are they compromised? Is their philosophy compromised anywhere along the way because of how they are measured, because of how their job impacts? And why it made me think ultimately about this was, for the first time in my life in the non-league setting in Wales, for the New Saints, Total Network Solutions as it was, we had to release players, adults. It was their job. But for the good of the whole, there was a certain time where some players had got older and we needed younger, and you had to let them go for the benefit of the collective. But with the philosophy of caring for an individual, I didn't want to let anybody go. But would I make my squad stronger if I let one older person go and recruited a younger person on less money? Yes. So you end up in a real difficult practical application of individual and collective beliefs and values of what's best for the collective or what's best for the individual. And I think some sports and cultures have different pressures on the coach.
I agree with that entirely. I would also encourage all coaches to think that what we're talking about here are some principles and in some cases ideals, but I don't see any contradiction in, for example, saying I'm an educationalist, I believe in the power of the individual, but because my context is here, I'm going to have to do some other behaviours, or I'm going to have to act in this way. I don't see those actually being contradictory in any way. To say, look, I know this over here, model X is the perfect, idealistic, utopian model of coaching. But also to think actually in the practical world, the pragmatic world of real, that actually there are some things we do that aren't utopian. And I think that's absolutely fine. And I think coaches should be really comfortable in that. And I think sometimes you do stuff just because it needs to be done. And you might acknowledge it's not the perfect way to do it. It's not an ideal learning environment, but it's the best we can do in the time that we've got, in the context that we've got, in the environment that we're in. And that's absolutely fine. And I think as long as you're questioning yourself, you're challenging yourself on that, I don't see any problem in that at all.
Frantically scribbling away here. You've sent me down the rabbit hole, and Andy, I definitely saw that competitive drive come out on you in the golf course yesterday. I just want to pick up on a few things. So principles is an interesting word, and it's something that we've been getting coaches who have been coming through our new pathway of courses at the FA thinking about, and comparing the term principles with rules. And it was interesting that you brought that up, and I find that if you're comfortable with principles being your guide rather than rules that you must abide, so principles are almost your soundboard. They're at your core, but you're not hamstrung by them. So I think that's where you were going with that, Don. Would that be correct?
Yeah, I think if anything hamstrings you, you're in trouble, really, and perhaps you haven't got it quite right, because I think principle-led is a strong term for me at the moment. Think principle-led, and that means we know where we're trying to get to and we're trying to head, but sometimes we're not always going to be able to get to the ideal. And in any leadership role, I think coaching is a leadership role, you're sometimes going to have to make decisions which aren't utopian or perfect, etc., to release that player or to discipline a player for the good of the club or the good of the rest of the team, or actually to run a practice which is perhaps counter to your educational values, because you've got to win the game on Tuesday night, or actually the pitch is, in my case, in hockey, the pitch is going to freeze in the next half an hour. We've got to get through this stuff as quickly as possible. We've got to keep people just moving, because they'll get fed up if we stop them and ask loads of questions, etc. We've just got to plough on through it, get through it, because it's the best we've got in the circumstances. So, but I think you can do those things consistently within the notion of being principle-led. Absolutely.
And that term you use, consistency, that's something that I recognise when I speak to certainly young players who are developing as people as well, is that they really appreciate that consistency of behaviour and routine from the coach, from the effective coaches, and they know where they stand. There's no surprises in behaviour, that they feel safe and secure and loved to an extent. And I get that feeling from speaking to young players who work with effective, certainly grassroots coaches that I work with.
Yeah, and I think the one thing I've learnt from watching coaches who I think are really good, they are the ones who appear really unflustered, really unstressed about stuff, because they're in control of that environment. Even if things don't go perfectly, they're quite comfortable with that, and that is the foundation that enables them to be consistent with people, because they feel in control. They've got a handle on it all, and they know how to manage or just to be comfortable with things going perhaps slightly awry, or people not getting out of it what they thought they were going to. They're quite comfortable with that, and it enables them to be consistent with people. The flip side of that is, getting really stressed about something because it's not quite going right, and then you start snapping at people, or you start being less consistent with people. So that's just a little thing I think that's important.
We did some filming last year for some resources for the new courses that we launched in August, and I got to interview many groups of players from under 7s right the way through to under 21s, male, female, different backgrounds. And one of the questions that we asked them is, what do you think makes a good coach? And one of the most common answers that we got back from the kids was, they don't stress out. It was really interesting that you've brought that up, and it's exactly the same as what the kids are saying.
Just drawing a couple of your both points together, the John Wooden Pyramid of Success type framework is often used by lots of governing bodies and lots of coaches to help make sense of what do you value and what are your building blocks as a coach and so on. And I think it gives you a really easy pictorial framework to start from. I think some of the things you've both been talking about then about, well, what do the athletes need and want, and how do you then as a coach perform on a daily basis? The reality is it's much more permeable. Some of those solid, hard building blocks, you're happy to loosen off on selected occasions. So if your team has agreed that these are the team rules and this is what we'll abide by, and here's a code of conduct, and this is what we all buy into and we want, but then a player steps out of line, sometimes it will depend how important is that player to them as to how you, the coach, are meant to deal with that. So for example, if it's your weakest player in the group that is causing problems for the group and they don't like him, and he steps out of line, actually the group are expecting you, the coach, to deal with that as per the code of conduct, as per the guidelines, and either get rid of the player or sanction him in some way or leave him out of the team and so on. If, however, it's your best player that steps out of line, are you, the coach, meant to react in the same way? Possibly not, because actually the expectations of the players are now very, very different. They realise if this best player doesn't play and they don't win this game, they effectively have less money. Their careers are impeded. Their consequences of the coach's actions have a bigger bearing. So actually their view on the philosophy and these rules and conducts, on selected occasions, they might be quite happy for you to bend the rules. And I've got a couple of lovely, lovely examples where actually you've got to listen to the players to gauge what is the coach's best response here, what is expected versus what is best for everybody. But are you the coach that says, I don't care about all of that, I've got these rules, I'm going to lead like this and manage like this because this is what I stand for? Or do you go, do you know what? Yes, this player has broken the rules and the guidelines, they have stepped over the line, I don't agree with that, but actually the bulk of the players want this player to play. Can I live with that? In the context of this game being very, very important for all of the players, and all of the players want player X to play, okay. Sometimes bending the rules might be seen as a strength by the coach or a weakness. So it becomes quite a complicated interplay between an individual player's perception of the rules and philosophy of the team, the coach's management of those rules and philosophies. Oh, by the way, if we're more successful or less successful, that shifts. So this becomes a real dynamic, fluid. People have talked about coaching as complex. I'm not sure it's complex, but it's complicated. And it's fascinating. And that's what draws coaches to want to deal with people. It's people-centred, social-centred, and I think you can have principles. I think it can be principle-led, but you have to be very, very aware of, in this instance today, what is actually shaping my decision and what are the perceptions and values of all of the people who are going to be in this decision and the consequences of it.
You mentioned a couple of examples. Are you able to share?
I've had some lovely players who have done things that they wouldn't necessarily be proud of. They have stepped beyond the lines of borders of legal and poor behaviour outside of the football pitch. On the football pitch, they've been excellent leaders and first-class examples of what you'd want as a performer, not so off the pitch. So there are many examples of this player behaviour off the field being one thing and on the field being something different. And the challenge to a coach is, well, how do you manage those people very, very effectively in the setting? So can I share things? Probably not without giving away the instances of individuals, but principles we could share about. There are many instances in different sports even of how when do you ban a player, whether that's because they've had issues with drugs, with alcohol, with prison. When do they have the right to re-engage with the sport? When do you as the coach have the right to re-engage them as a sport? Answer, it depends. And it's the severity, it's the age, it's the consequence. But back to this bit about people seem to be a bit more forgiving of a better player than a poorer player. So if you're genuinely being consistent as a coach, it should be, I'm making decisions right for everybody, and I'd treat them all in the same way. And I have to say, I'm not sure I always have. I think I'd share the stories. I can share examples of me making probably inconsistent decisions because it suited both me as a coach. This feels right to do this, but it felt right to do something different for a different player at a different time. So I think just individual different decisions at different times. I can't share anything more than that.
That's okay. I want to rewind slightly, and Don, you spoke about those two examples of how a coach made you feel, and a lot of the conversation we've talked about here has revolved around that human element, that feeling. Going through my own youth football journey, we had a coach. I use the term coach. He was our leader, if you like, our manager, around about 14 to 17 years old. Turbulent time in my own life. Guy called Paul Grounds. He was like a second dad. I wouldn't say if you asked him what his coaching philosophy was, he would have one. In fact, his football technical knowledge was limited to an extent. But what he did and the way that he treated us as, well, we were effectively teenagers, but he treated us as young adults with respect. I can't ever remember a time when he raised his voice in all the time that he worked with us, but we fought so hard for him, and he was like a father figure to us all. He was fantastic, and it was more that feeling that he gave us rather than anything special or any one event that he particularly did. It was that consistency and that feeling that he brought within us that made us play so hard for him. So it was interesting to hear your point there. What benefit would a coach get from having some clarity on their own coaching philosophy? So out there listening into this podcast now, we've got hundreds, if not thousands, of coaches who probably range from grassroots, under sevens, right their way up to elite, male and female. What benefit would a coach get from starting to think about their own coaching philosophy, if they haven't done already?
I think any opportunity to ask that fundamental question, why am I doing it like this? Why have I designed the practice in this way, and how could it be better? If that's a genuine question and a deep question where people are really seeking how to improve, that any of those mechanisms is a good thing. And one way of doing that is to look at your foundational beliefs. So if one of my foundational beliefs is on the individual and on trying to design a really bespoke journey for each individual that says, if I've got 30 girls coming to a training day, for example, that means, according to my philosophy anyway, that each of those individuals should understand something of what they're trying to do individually, how they're trying to develop individually. That puts pressure on me to design things in a way that's going to benefit those individuals, and to hopefully provide some information or some feedback or some mechanisms to gain feedback anyway, which they can have individual takeaways from, knowing also that actually, you know, they're part of a collective. And sometimes, this is one of my failings as a coach, perhaps I design some really great activities that are brilliant for the group, they work well, they're engaging, etc., but I forget about the individual in that sometimes, because it's difficult to think about 30 individuals in a group when we're trying to, you know, manage everybody at the same time. So examine it, just keep going back to that philosophical belief that you know, that core value of the individual at the centre really helps me to challenge my everyday practice design.
Where the question of what is your coaching philosophy, or why is it, or how did it get formed, I think why those questions are simple and useful to a young coach and an experienced coach are, it gives you the basis of reflection. So at any moment in time, you say, in the last week, in the last 6 months, how consistent have you been, Coach Andy, to your behaviours, to your values? How consistent have you been? And when you actually start there, you start looking at yourself. So part of this evolution of a philosophy, or the continual growth of a philosophy, enables you to keep close to, well, what's important to you as a coach. So if you keep asking yourself this question, you know, not every day, but regularly, I think it gives you a sense check as to, am I being true to myself? Am I being authentic? Am I still in coaching because of what I value? And by keep asking yourself those questions, I think it's motivating. It's, yes, that's what I'm in it for. That's why I'm doing coaching. It brings me back to individual development. It brings me back to team success, team building, and I feel I'm adding value to a group. So I think most coaches, especially the groups I currently work with, are great developers of people. They genuinely want to help people, and if they can win as well, that's fantastic. But at heart, if you're not developing the individuals and they don't believe in you and trust you, so this relationship element of what is a coach, so very much the social, what's going to help the bonding between coach and athlete and get this better, all of that gets linked back to what do you value? Because if you can't articulate what's important to you as a coach, your players don't understand you. So whether I would have packaged it as what is coaching philosophy, or whether I package it as what's important to you as a coach, and what do you want your performers to understand about you as a coach, so that they can understand your consistency, that helps. Remembering it might be different with every group that you then start to engage with, because you'll engage with them at different times for different reasons, and for different elements of what is success. Success will look different for the under-7s coach, the under-9s coach, the professional coach who's in a development setting where they are in a talent pathway and they're meant to develop players for a first team, or indeed a first team coach. But all of those coaches can use the question, am I being authentic? Am I being true to my beliefs and values? And I think that's why the question is important.
Thanks, Andy. You remind me of a time when I actually started to formalise my own coaching philosophy, because beforehand I don't know if I was really coaching. I was just pulling off sessions from the internet and putting them on without any real thought to why I was doing what I was doing, or why I was behaving as I was. And I came across a blog by a guy called John Kessler. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. He is the head of US volleyball development, I think still to this day. And this was about 2009, I believe. I was working with Everton girls in their Centre of Excellence. I was living on my own in Liverpool. I had a lot of thinking and reading time, and I came across this blog, and his blog challenged coaches to sum up their values, their coaching philosophy, if you like, in 3 words. So put a little restricting constraint on, and it really got me thinking. And I thought about this for what feels like now months, And it really challenged me to narrow down to myself what was important. So funnily enough, they all began with the letter P. So people first. I was working with, yes, they were players, but I had to view them as people first, and complex individuals, all unique in their own way. Patience was a value, I think, that was most important to me. I was working with young players who were learning, developing at their own rates. It wasn't linear, it wasn't straightforward. There were good days, bad days. So I had to make sure that my core behaviour was one that demonstrated patience and process, to remind me that of the process of learning, that we are helping these young people to learn the game. And that really helped me to narrow down and start the ball rolling with my own thoughts around coaching philosophy. I don't know if there was a particular moment or an event or a period of time in your own coaching journey where you started to have these questions, and whether there was a process that you went through to almost formalise your own views on your values, beliefs.
I'll let Don think about that difficult question for a second. As you were speaking then, just something jumped into my head. I have equally come across some great coaches who could not answer that question. They would not be able to articulate their beliefs and values in a spoken word or want to be constrained by it. But when you saw their behaviours in a day in, day out basis and their interaction with their players and teams, individuals, they role model first class behaviour and first class coaching. But if you ask them, what is your belief, what is your value, some would struggle to say. So I was introducing that as some of the best coaches I've seen on the field of coaching and teaching and leading and helping players understand don't over intellectualize this process. They're just good deliverers of information, very, very clear, and that's it. Because you started the conversation by saying, oh, I thought I was a coach and I was pulling some sessions off and just delivering a session. But that is coaching. That is coaching, as well as all of these other things. And in terms of the performance end of a player being better after a session or after a period of time, some coaches are better at that than others. Some coaches are better if you have a group of players for a short space of time, take them from A to B quickly. Some coaches are very good at that. They're not actually very good with relationships over a longer period of time. So all of a sudden you're drawing up a model here of different types of coaches who can be very, very good at different types of aspects of the coaching process. All of it is important, but very rarely do you get all of that ideal picture. If you think in your particular sport of 5 successful coaches, they're probably successful for slightly different reasons and with slightly different groups. So they may all have a philosophy, it may look different, but they might not always be able to articulate it. You said it took you months, maybe years, to be able to come up with the 3 Ps. I'm not sure I can still come up with 3 Ps now, and I've been thinking and doing this 30, 35 years. It's good to ask the question. You might not always be able to give the answer, but it starts the reflective process. It starts you to question what's important. So sometimes the process of asking it and thinking about it is as important as to getting a defined answer.
I think it's still quite a contemporary focus, this idea of values, beliefs, philosophy, etc. Perhaps, the term culture has been particularly rampant the last 5-6 years or so, etc. And I think coaches are often a product of their environments, and for many years this term wouldn't have been something that was core to many sports or coach education environments. It kind of is now. So Andy and I recently spent some time investigating a program of development for junior international coaches across a whole number of sports. This kind of stuff was fundamental to everything they had done for several years. So when we asked them about their philosophy, they had a very slick response because they'd been thinking about it and challenged to think about it for quite some time, and could make those connections between values, beliefs, philosophy, whatever you call it, and their practice. But that's not always that common. And it's something that we're we think is of value, but it's hardly a marker of. There's no great evidence out there to say those with the most refined philosophy, for example, are the best practitioners. I'm not aware of any evidence of that.
And this whole discussion takes us into a really interesting debate about, okay, so now even if you have got a clear idea of your philosophy, we're now working as a teaching team, a coaching team of 3. So Don has his philosophy, you, Jack, have yours, and I have mine. 3 strong individuals, strong beliefs about what's right, what's wrong, how to do things. But this might not be similar. But now all of a sudden we have to work with one another on a daily basis, deal with any issues that come up with our collective team, and be comfortable with our collective response, be comfortable with compromise. So I have worked with some lovely, lovely people. I've worked as an assistant and I've worked as a head coach. That relationship and interaction between different coaches when faced with different issues is just fascinating. And there comes the potential for conflict. It's when all 3 of you are in line and align with your values and beliefs, it's easy how to deal with an issue. However, when an issue happens and there is disagreement, or it sits outside one of your belief systems for one of you, then it starts to become uncomfortable. If it's an isolated incident, it's okay, you move on to the following day and so forth. But if consistently one of the 3 of us now supports a certain behaviour or acts in a certain way, but the other 2 don't believe in that, how do we now resolve because we now have a conflict. It's that elephant in the dressing room. I'm looking at you, coaching, going, I don't believe in what you're saying there. Me and Don are looking at one another going, we both know, but you're head coach, what do we do about this? If we raise it, are you upset? If we raise it, do you sack us? If I raise it, should I just say, look, I'm in the wrong and I walk away? So somewhere down this line, there's this issue of one, you've got to know yourself and why you do things the way you do. And then I think as you go into coaching in a range of different domains, you're coaching with others and with other coaches and teams of coaches. So you as a team of coaches have to agree to disagree sometimes. And there'll always be a corridor of, yeah, I'm okay, I'm comfortable within this, I can tolerate that. But then there'll be a point at which you go, no, I will not prepare to tolerate that. So in the past I've had to release coaches, or I've had to walk away from instances if my personal beliefs and value systems have been compromised too much. And that's okay, because the other person wouldn't even recognise that this is an issue. And everybody has their different systems. What's important is those different groups of coaches can work together, ideally to resolve the conflict. But if you can't resolve the conflict, we'll move on. Keep coaching in a different domain. But the knock-on effect here is, of course, you start to recruit players that you feel comfortable working with because they fit into your values or belief systems. Okay, that's okay. If you've been at one club and consistently that's what you recruit, everybody knows Don's club as honest, trustworthy, hard-working, fun. That's the sort of player that Don will recruit into his system, and he's got a happy ship. But then Don decides to leave his club and go to Club Y across the city. Don inherits a different group. So now as a coach, you've got a different issue. You may have beliefs, values, all nicely established of what you want, but actually I've shifted culture. I've shifted from what I've built and had to something that's completely different. My job now is to change culture. So I've got to start again. I've got to get those building blocks in place again with the new group. Now that might mean changing individuals' beliefs as opposed to recruiting new ones. So there's a different skill set now. One, recruiting the type of person that you want to work with keeps everything going and growing. And it's easy for successful teams to keep being successful because they're building what they've already got. Long-term development, everything's established, everything's clear, everything works. But there are equally then some coaches who are very, very good at short-term change, making a big impact with a different group in the short term and almost change management. And again, that's a different set of skills. So you might be very good at long-term evolution of a culture, growing, developing people, or you might be very good as a firefighter. I'm going into Club X, situation X, and I'll manage it for 3 months and then I'll walk out and I'll have effected change for the group. So all of a sudden, coaching is different in different context settings and so forth.
I think I'm going to take this slightly differently, but building on the essence of what Andy was talking about there in terms of how to perhaps view others who maybe have slightly different beliefs from you or may act in slightly different ways. And I just remember a really important instance in my life that really challenged me on this front, because already for years I had been that coach who said the individual is really important, and in doing that, educationally, my perspective was, well, if we want to understand how people learn, then we have to understand their background, perspective, their culture, their environment, etc. And all of those things are really important. And for want of getting a bit academic about this, apologies, my epistemology or my foundational belief of how people learn has been for years that that there are many different truths, if you like. There are many different things that are correct. Each individual has their own value system that is true to them, and they will work things out as they best see fit. Most people will have a good mindset to try and grow and develop in the way that they best see fits in their route. But our systems commonly in coaching pitch that quite differently. So, for example, in my for years as a university tutor, we educate novice coaches, those right at the beginning of their careers, which is a really exciting stage. But often, when we perhaps will observe our students at 18, 19, 20 years old delivering a coaching session that they're exploring, often a question that they will come with, they'll come over and we'll give them some feedback. Their first question will be, was that right? You think, and in your heart you want to say, well, what a ridiculous question. You say, was that coaching session right? But in a way, our systems have prepared us for that, and our sporting culture prepares us to think about it in that way as well, that almost there is a right way to do it. Our coach education systems across the sports for years has sort of said, if you do it this way, you will pass, for example, or you will get through. Or if you replicate this practice, then you will be the next level, or you will be a better coach if you do it like person X, etc. And I think that actually that's fundamentally unhelpful in trying to learn about sort of educationally informed processes and programs. So this really hit me when I first came to the realization that actually, for all of my really in-depth scrutiny, thinking, investigation into loads of different perspectives educationally from a research background, I can bring all of that together. I can try and sift what I think is good, right, good quality, not good quality. What have we got evidence for? What have we not got? I can think about that, and I've been thinking about that for nearly 20 years now. And I've got to some positions which some of which I'm quite firm about, and I really believe in. Some of which I'm still developing. But actually, that's quite I would say, mature developmental point to be. Got a lot of years now thinking about investigating this stuff, and I think, right, so this is where I'm at. I'm here, but 3 feet away is Andy, who has gone through a similar process and has got to a bit of a different perspective. We don't think exactly the same way. In fact, we would place emphasis and believe in slightly different things. And where I've got to get you then as a coach, as an educator, is to say, great, how arrogant would it be of me to think that I'm right and Andy is wrong, or that anybody else is wrong, that you're wrong, Jack, or etc. What a ridiculous thing to think. In the same way that student who comes and says, was my coaching session right, to be able to, for me to be able to say, well, somebody else is wrong in the way that they operate.
I think the beauty of coaching at all levels, all ages, all domains is there is no one correct way to coach. So I talked in the past about if you had conflict with a coach, but actually conflict's okay, because actually from where that coach is, there's no conflict, and actually with a different group of players, that coach is first class for that different group of players. So in the world of sport, the different sports, in the world of football, think about all of the different types of backgrounds of where players come from and where coaches come from, and how these people come together to perform. There is no one best way. You can overthink it, make it very, very complicated. Or actually, sometimes if you go naturalistic, you just go with it. You just go with what you think's right. And some of the best coaches are so simple and so effective that they would question, Andy, why are you intellectualising this to the level that you are? Coaching's coaching. Just make them better. Well, what does that look like? And then you come into a whole sequence of things about what makes individual better and what does better mean. Well, actually, at different ages and different levels, better can be real subtleties of nothing to do with cooperating with somebody and being more confident and being... Actually, the subtleties might be at an elite level, getting the timing of a block right to get somebody else free to score a goal. But blocking, and that's against the rules of the game, isn't it? Not if it's about winning. So all of a sudden you're into what do you accept, what's acceptable for you as a coach on the pitch, what are you prepared to accept in order to win. But there's also the culture then of the profession, what's going on to win and what's allowed, what are the rules, or interpretations of the rules. I had some lovely colleagues in Spain, Italy, at an international tournament, and in genuine conversations after the game were saying, I hope you don't mind me asking, but why do you allow your kids to cheat? And they were offended. They said, what do you mean our kids don't cheat? I said, there's some diving, there's rolling around, you're time wasting, you're just, it's not the heart of the game. We're trying to teach these young people some values. And they'd said, well, so are we. That's what the game is. We're teaching them how to win a game legitimately. The referee decides, is a foul, or what is and what isn't. Our kids are just doing what they see. They're copying behaviours of what elite players are doing. And if they think getting a free kick is success, and if a defender has been silly enough to try and lunge into a tackle, made no contact, it's okay for my player to dive over that to get a free kick, because actually they've interfered with the flow of that attack. That's okay. And these were genuine, intelligent, well-spoken, good coaches with a good philosophy, but what's allowed, or what their perception of what fair play was and what their kids can do, was completely different because of the culture in which they were in and their value of what they were trying to produce. So things are just different around the cultures and in different sports about what's acceptable and to what degree you're trying to do things.
I've just got another example, really, of the starkness of that cultural importance. So, two little bits. So I mentioned I've been involved with the under-16s national stuff for our hockey girls team, and we play in just European stuff, all of whom really see things largely in the same way, developmentally from a country's perspective. So when I first joined the system, some of the other coaches in the programme were talking about a Six Nations championship that they had gone to in Germany a couple of years before, and it's the sort of the big end of season, it's the main thing we head to, and they said, it was brilliant. They really got it because there were no scoreboards or tables, etc. All of the nations, they weren't bothered who won, it was just a developmental tool, even at international under-16 level. I went, great, brilliant, how that's the way it should be, shouldn't it? Nobody cares if Spain under-16 beat Germany 3-2 or whatever, nobody cares, it's about development, surely. And then I spent the back half of the summer writing some resources for some very different nations, and I remember talking to one cricket coach from Pakistan who said, I absolutely understand where you're coming from, that my under-12s cricket team should absolutely be about development, and there should be no focus on winning at all. But he said, culturally, every game that I lose brings shame and dishonour on my family. So it's completely unacceptable in that culture for me to say it's development first, because it's really, really important for this community to be seen that our under-12 cricket team beat the next village along, etc., to win. And it really took me back, because for years I'd kind of almost written that off as even a potential point of importance. Surely junior sport all about development. Well, in some contexts, that is a really challenging narrative. It's just not true, actually. And they might recognise it's not perfect, but, that's the way the world is in some places.
And if you broaden, we're talking, in this talk today about to all coaches. But if you then broaden that outside of the UK and look at coaches in underdeveloped countries, countries where the games, whether that's football, hockey, tennis, are growing in different ways, the role of a coach and what a coach does can be many different things. So a good coach in Nigeria, where I used to live, where there are no resources, there are minimal pitches, maybe not many footballs, what a good coach looks like there, even at elite level, may be very different to what an elite coach in an academy system in this country looks like. So there are principles, there are generalities, there are cultures, there are global differences between what a coach is. I think going right back to the beginning, you asked about how does philosophy and the question of what is philosophy to a coach mean. It just allows them to look at themselves about where are they now as a coach. And there is no right thing to do. There is no one way of learning. It's, okay, this is where I'm at, and why am I still enjoying it? What do I want to do? How can I help others? How can I win a game? All of those questions are perfectly legitimate, and all coaches will have different questions that are important at different times. It's not for anybody else to say that's not an important question, because it is to them at that moment in time.
Yeah, it's interesting that you both talked about how important the language is in defining the culture. And I want to move on and probe some more about your under-16s experiences, Don. But you've just reminded me of a couple of experiences from my own coaching. So 12 months ago, when I was looking after the under-12s team in our club, we have two under-12s teams. The other one was on the verge of folding. Unfortunately, the coach of that team had to step away. So I didn't want those boys to drop out of the game of football, because since adding another P to my own beliefs, the context in which I work, preservation is really important to me. So preserving these young people in the game for as long as they possibly can is really important. I remember saying to a group of under-7s parents a few years ago when I took that team that before their first ever match, these boys are 6. Success for us may well be if they're still playing when they're 66. So let's remember that as we go through this together this season. So 12 months ago, we merged the two teams, and the team that I'd been familiar with or worked with for the last few years, our culture of practice, if you like, which we tried to shape from within by asking the boys regularly, what style, what type of team, how do we want to play, and how can we as coaches help you to play that way. They very much wanted to be a team who played attractive football, whatever that may be, and kept the ball and were able to express themselves. So we kind of had this expectation that we wouldn't kick the ball out of play, which a lot of coaches will resonate with, that children in this country are often praised and applauded and rewarded for kicking the ball out of play. So we decided to try and get rid of that and remove that from our play. Simple practices like if a player would do that in training, then we will give a free kick to the other team. And this became regular, and it almost eradicated that behaviour. And we allowed it in certain circumstances, and on a match day they were free to make that decision. But when the other group joined and we merged the two teams, these boys had come from a culture, if you like, a team environment where that was actually allowed and in oftentimes encouraged. So we almost had to rewire some of the boys to think differently about the way that they play, and have them understand that it's okay to bring the ball down under pressure, and you might give it away and we might give a goal away, but that's all right. We won't get angry with you if you try, and your teammates will understand that you're trying to keep the ball for the right reasons for our team. So that kind of language and behaviours and the way it defines culture, I think's really important. You mentioned, Andy, about the best coaches are able to simplify, and we're going to get him on in a few episodes, but a colleague of mine from the FA, Ben Bartlett, who I know you know, he's had a profound effect on my own, and I know other colleagues of mine, way of thinking with challenging our use of language. So good, bad, right, wrong, unlucky, those sorts of words, what do they actually mean? And I know, Don, you picked up on that before, and it certainly made me think about the type of language that I use, and I find that it impacts on my own behaviours. for me, what I would deem a positive way. Don, I want to move on and get some of your experience with your 16s. We recently had a staff conference and Alex Danson came in, and I have never seen 1,000 people in a futsal arena so encapsulated by one person and her story. What was really profound to me was the team ethic that had been created within GB hockey. And she really stole the show. It was incredible to listen to, very inspiring. I wonder if you'd be able to share any insights of maybe how you start that process off with your own under-16s, given that most of your players, I'm gathering, live all corners of the country. How do you start to develop that environment with you and your own team?
Well, our first step was to invite Alex in to talk to them, and literally she did come in and she talked to the group, and I think what is core to Alex's message, but also core to our contemporary way of thinking about culture, is to be very athlete centered and athlete empowered in the way that we set those cultures. So in the GB hockey team, as far as I'm aware, a lot of those behaviours and codes, or the culture essentially, was set by the group and by the team, and they came up with several trademark statements, if you like, that would encapsulate their journey. So I'm sure that Alex would have talked to you about sort of inspiring a generation, essentially, as being something that was really important to the group, and that was a way in which they tried to place their journey as being of greater importance than just their own journey to a gold medal, but it was about trying to impact the broader world of the sport, essentially, and to grow the sport. They also had things like they put a specific number down as the number of people in the squad who would contribute to that journey, not just the 18, but essentially recognising that it would take a much bigger squad and group of people, some of who wouldn't get a medal, some of who wouldn't even go to the Olympics or would miss out, etc., and trying to recognise that they were equally as important in that journey. And then one of the other things that stood out for us was how much importance they placed on, if you like, flattening the hierarchies in the group. So Andy talked earlier about valuing the more important or the better players in the group, and I think that team worked really hard at flattening those hierarchies. So, the captain, Kate Richardson-Walsh, and the leader, I think, was really determined that the weakest player in that centralised programme would be as valuable, or as far as you can ever do that, to the group as possible. And so what we tried to do with the under-16s is give the girls the right, the control to develop those key phrases, trademarks, whatever you want to call them, and those key behaviours that would be illustrative of the group, and they would take the responsibility to develop them and to police them to a certain extent. So Alex came to talk to them. They turned around. The first thing they said was, well, I think we're going to come up with this little mnemonic, say, what would Alex do? As a way of challenging each other to say, how would they approach particular elements of the programme, or perhaps even when they're away from camp, to think in that way. Because one of the stories that Alex gave was her being an under-16 international, and she said that she wasn't very good technically, and that when she joined the programme, they did a bleep test, and that she got an average score, wasn't very good, and she recognised that what she needed to do was to be super fit, because that was something that she could be outstanding at. And she said she went away and she went home and she said, Dad, I want you to go to running with me every day. And apparently her dad said to her, I'll go running with you, but you're going to have to get me up to go. I'm not going to get you up. And she did, and she got him up every day. They went running, and when she came back to that program slightly later, she had improved exponentially in her development. And that little stories like that really impacted the group to say, we're inspired by this person, we're going to try and use her inspirational quality as a what would Alex do type mnemonic to say, how could we approach our everyday way of being. but in all sorts of other things as well, from small things about turning up to meetings with your water bottle and your pen and paper appropriately clothed on time, all those kind of little things, through to the bigger things of playing style and being together as a group. So they decided that whenever they were going to a practice or they would have a meeting point, and they would walk to the pitch or walk to the changing room together and as a group, rather than drip feed into it, because they wanted to be together as a team all of the time. And sort of little things like that. We said in this program, they designed that, they wrote that down, and we just give them the opportunity every now and again to come back to that, essentially, and just do a collective check, if you like.
But this aspect of celebrating difference. Sometimes we can end up talking about coaching stories, the power of an individual, how Team X did it. Therefore, coaches go, well, I've got to do that then in order to be successful. I think you can definitely, if you can understand the principles of what the coach has been trying to do and the principles of what the players have bought into, that's first and foremost for a young coach or an experienced coach the most important thing. Because when you then come to apply those principles in your own context, actually this looks very different. So the example, I would consider, I've had two very successful seasons with two different teams. The first success is winning the league, getting into Europe Champions League. Success, that's what success looks like for that group. Switching to another group, success is late formed, inherited players, keep this team in a division. Now actually my principles are the same, but I have to operate those principles in two different contexts in completely different ways. The players would not take ownership in the second example very quickly. They want to be told. They have got no starting point about, well, we're not sure what you want here. So there's an element of the coach now leading his or her principles. I want this to happen because X, Y, and Z. And over time, we might get to a more player-led team group cohesiveness where it manages itself. But very rarely do coaches have the same situation. So the principles, I think, for coaches to understand where they're at is, where am I with this group of people at this moment in time, and what exactly am I trying to do in the next week, in the next month, in the next 3 months? And then we'll review how he or she or the group decide to do that. Depends on the group. I've had very, very intelligent players being able to articulate why we did a training session. So we debrief a training session. We've just done this. I'm just checking. What is it you saw us do? We played five-a-side, said one player. Correct observation. We did. Accurate. In terms of analysis, understanding the deeper things that we were trying to get, nothing had gone in for that particular player. Coach's fault. Ask a different player, they would say, no, we did a drill, it looked like five-a-side, but actually you were shaping that game around individual X. You were asking them to be a holding shape, always play behind the ball, very, very simple, very, very effective, and you were giving that player some practice at doing that. Correct. So two different players within the group perceived a training session in completely different ways. You, the coach, did have a particular aim in mind, but actually you had an aim in mind for individual A, one outcome. For the group, you had a different outcome, but actually what they took from it was many different things. So I suppose it's, again, to try and simplify, yes, we're about individual development, we're about team development and culture and growth, but we've also got to celebrate difference and the fact that some people may not get what you're trying to do quickly. They might get it over time. And bless my old captain, fantastic bit of advice about 3 months into a new job, new club. He said, Andy, I'm sure you know your football. I'm sure you're analysing, writing down a lot of notes. But please, 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 when you come in at half time, just make it more simple. Do not overanalyse this game for us. We're in the middle of a game. Tell us what you want. Is that what you want? Yes. And that always stuck with me because I was going, well, ask the players what they think first. How did that first half go for you all? Was it all right? Was it okay? What do you want to do better? What do you want to do? No, tell us. but that was that player, that team in that context. And at different stages, you get different things.
How tempting, Don, is it within your own environment? It is an elite programme. How tempting is it to tell or to question or to guide or cajole? What's the thought process that runs through your head when you get these girls in camp? And how often do you see them? And talk us through the process that you go through.
So we only get these girls for about 40 days a year, including the sort of competition elements, and that goes through different phases of the year. So we're currently in the beginning of June, and they are probably currently, right as we're speaking, in exams, and they are consumed at the moment in their mindset by their exam performance. So we have a weekly contact with them at the moment, just trying to keep them engaged to a certain extent, and doing what we can to prepare in line for our sort of final 3 series, which come up fairly quickly at the end of their exam period. And then throughout the year, we've had some day camps, some 2-day camps, some 3-day camps. We've been had a couple of international series against some very high quality teams and some teams that are perhaps not quite as good as us. In the sole aim of this program is to try and feed the next generation, or the next level, essentially. So we are trying to provide or create an overflow of players who are capable of playing under 18s at the next level up. It's solely about development. Nobody say we don't care. It really doesn't matter whether we win all 5 games at the Six Nations, or whether we lose all 5 games. It really doesn't matter. And the series results. So actually, in this environment, the desire to tell, to instruct, to be dictatorial is virtually zero, because it's all about the development of the individual player and trying to. So we can be actually quite educationally enlightened's the wrong term. We can work to some pretty altruistic principles, if you like, just trying to help them develop. So we put them in lots of. What we're trying to do, I guess, is trying to create environments all the time which look as similar to junior international playing environments as possible, and then to explore particular principles and ways of experimenting and playing through those environments as we can. So those things are very scenario-led, they're very question-led, principle-led, and it's very much about exploration of those things. We know that it would be impossible for this kind of group in the time that we've got to try and put very prescriptive structures in place that you might need to do, perhaps in a performance environment, very quickly, and say you're going to press like this, you're going to outlet like this, you're going to all those kind of things. It would be impossible to do that effectively with the limited time that we have with this group at the stage that they're at in their hockey careers, which for many of them is still right at the beginning, really. Some of them are only 14 years old. So it's very much about putting them in, exposing them to the environment, to trying to help them along individually, and to try and get them to have a really good perspective of growing and developing as into hopefully a senior international hockey player. And for all of them, that's the goal, which is partly why the Alex Danson intervention was so effective, because that was their target, if you like. That's who they want to be, not necessarily positionally, but as an athlete, and that's where we're trying to get them, with that right set of psychological skills in terms of their positioning, but their attitudes, as well as their sort of physique and skill set, etc. That's where we're going.
This might be an unfair question, so throw it back if it is. So you mentioned about Alex and the story that you gave around her waking her dad up to go out for a run to improve her fitness. It would seem from this point of view that she's a very driven from within person. How might, or even can, a coach influence that inner drive within the players that in their care? So
for me, this relates very strongly to to self-determination theory from an academic perspective, and I think that's quite. It's very popular at the moment, but actually it's been quite long-standing as a theoretical perspective, and I think there are some really sound principles in there, and those principles are simply, if you give people a sense of control over what they're doing, they have the right to make some decisions. They can be quite guided decisions. So, for example, you might give them the choice of two, for example, or you might say, do you want to do this by method X or by method Y? Or you could make it more open and say, well, perhaps you could design this culture, if you like, as you see fit. It's then it's about helping them to understand their strengths, their competence in an environment. So it's about reaffirming that and to help them to understand that they are, as all our girls in the 16s program are, they are very good at what they do. They have great qualities and they have great value to add to the entire environment, and for them to try and to help them to be secure in that understanding of their own competence, but then to try and make them feel a really important part of the group as well, so they have a strong sense of belonging and relatedness. And I think if you can, I strongly believe at the moment that those are three really foundational principles of almost all environments. That sense of autonomy, that sense of control over what you're doing, that you believe that you're good at this, that you've got something to offer, and that to recognise that is valued by the group. I think if you can put those three things in place, then that will lead to a greater sense of drive, intrinsic motivation, whatever you want to call it.
Andy, one of the phrases that you mentioned before was, it depends, and we'll have a varied range of coaches working in a multitude of environments, and the decisions that they make and the way in which they behave may very well much depend on the context, the situation. That being said, what Don's just put forward there around trying to create that environment that is self-determined would seem on the surface like something relevant regardless of the environment in which a coach is working in. Would you agree?
Yes, I agree with everything Don says.
You're going to say it depends then.
I agree with everything Don says. It depends in the context. As Don was talking, I was reminded of Dick Bate. Dick Bate is a good friend of mine and one of the best coach educators, but also one of the best coaches I've seen. In terms of creating a motivational climate, self-determination theory, he could do that with any group given in any time frame. But what that actually looked like was very different. And if you didn't know what he was trying to do, you might see him in isolation with an international under-17s group acting in a certain way that might appear very autocratic. You're doing this for this reason, and this is the outcome. But actually, given the time constraints, he was trying to be pragmatic and saying, if we don't get this defensive shape right, if we don't do this, actually we won't succeed. And actually, the longer we can hang on in this tournament, the better we will get, we will grow, and we will be better by the end. But if you catch him coaching in one instance, you'd get a completely different picture of what he was actually doing. In a different context, it depends, you would see him being questioning, able to ask things, have more time, treat the players in a different way, and you would describe him as a different coach. But actually, if you distilled what he was doing in both environments with the different teams, at heart, motivational climate, believed in the individuals, but it looked different. And that's the danger for young coaches when they see somebody work or they hear somebody speak, they copy. And sometimes they copy, it's not the same thing that they're copying. What Dick was doing in one context was very correct, was very right, but if you copied that to a different group, it might not work because you didn't actually understand what he was doing. So why I dived in on the mic was, you talk about self-determination theory, motivational climate, environments and cultures. I think for young coaches, the sooner they come to understand those concepts, those terms, and the detail that sits within those terms, I think the more they understand the detail, actually, the more different their coaching behaviours might look in different contexts, because they understand the subtleties of what this is. So, it depends is still my get-out answer, and I've come full circle. I wanted to do my PhD when I went to university on coach effectiveness. But back in 1985, my perception of what coach effectiveness was, well, what does this coach do? She does this, he does this, therefore that must be right. The more I've understood and tried to learn about coaching, it depends is actually the correct answer. Coach effectiveness depends on situation, context, age, motivational climate, what is success, what are you comfortable with, what is your philosophy, what do the players want, and this becomes such a social relationship, interconnected world of coaching. Effective coaching can look very, very different for different groups. So all of the different coaches working in different sports and different age groups, just be yourself. Trust yourself for where you're at with coaching now. Just make honest decisions. What do you think's right for that group today and tomorrow and the day after? And that's absolutely fine. Don't over-question and be over-critical. Yes, reflect what's worked and what's not worked. But just do. Get into coaching. Do lots of coaching. And only, I think, by doing lots of coaching do you then start to understand these subtleties of time, pressures, what will work for certain groups. Do I need to focus more on the individual or more on the team? It depends. That individual with this team is really, really important for me. Therefore, I've got to look after that individual. In a different context, that individual will be no good in this other team because actually the rest of the team won't tolerate their behaviour. So that individual becomes less important to me. But it's all context driven and what you're comfortable with.
Absolutely. And it takes me back to when I graduated from university myself, and be honest, I came out with quite an ego. I was just done my UEFA B at 21, 22 and thought I knew everything there was to know. And the longer I went on down the rabbit hole, it reminded me of a quote. I'm going to butcher this now, and I think it was Isaac Newton, but someone will correct me on that. The larger the island of knowledge, the longer the coastline of the unknown. So in other words, the more that you know, the more that you realise you don't yet know. And that kept me in good stead. Reminded me of that copycat behaviour. When the first team, it was an under-18s school team that I was coaching straight out of university. And it was just at the time when the FA were releasing videos on the FA.com of England training sessions. So this for me was magic because all I would do, what's I think it was Sven-Goran Eriksson and Steve McLaren were working at the time, and I would just literally go on and I'll take that session and do it with the boys tonight. Did it work? Absolutely not. But at that point in that stage of my own coaching, I didn't really have the understanding to recognise how important that context is.
The subtleties of understanding why coaches have done something is wonderful, and it's unless you ask the coach, what was your desired outcome for that particular part of the session? Why did you do that? You don't know. You don't understand what's inside the coach's head. So an example, for many, many years in professional football, at the start of training, you would see these little circles, wouldn't you, of players stood around a circle and having a bit of fun and a bit of laughter and people running in the middle trying to get a touch on it. And for years I used to think, what a waste of time. Why is a coach allowing that to happen and ruin 15 minutes of the available hour and a bit coaching time on frivolous behaviour? That was me as a novice. Come full circle, I asked a really experienced coach, I won't explain the context here, why do you allow that to happen? You know that you could use the time, Andy, it's got nothing to do with what I'm trying to teach. I need them to come from the dressing room into my main bulk of my session where I want them to learn and understand something and where I'm going to start to help and direct. But I can't expect them to come from dressing room to that warmed up mentally, physically to learn. So I allow that activity purely so they can get out of their system a lot of energy, a lot of frustration, a bit of laughter, a bit of banter, a social domain. Get that done in that context, and actually now I'm quite happy for other coaches to get that happen because they're better at that than I. So when they come to me, they're in a state to learn, and it's almost an unwritten rule. It's the flow of the session. Dressing room, bit of a warm-up physically, bit of a warm-up mentally, bit of a warm-up socially, bit of a warm-up technically, all of the different four corner things, all done in a nice environment where they're enjoying it, they're comfortable, and if a particular individual's struggling on a certain day, they can join in or not join in to the extent that they want, so they have choice, they have autonomy of getting engaged in this. But they know then after 25 minutes, half an hour when they come to me, and the bulk of the substantive session is about X, they're all as ready as they can be on that day. They wouldn't be ready if I was trying to go into that straight away. Now, that is a really complicated way of explaining the first 25 minutes of a training session. But in reality, if I was just copying, I might copy that behaviour and think, that little circle, that's what's got to be in a good session. No. There was a real thought through, deliberate policy. So when I see that little circle happen in a different session, where actually they allow 2 minutes for it, now let's move on. You've missed the understanding of why that was important. You've not actually allowed it to go long enough to get to where you need to be for them to transition into the learning phase of what I'm about. And some days 2 minutes is enough, but other days I need 15 minutes at it because they've had a defeat at the weekend. They're actually getting rid of their angst, they're getting rid of all of that, and we just need that to go on. And then I think the effective coach has this through observation, through diagnosis, they're ready now, let's move on to the next bit. But that's a real trained eye and experience. It's not copying the practice. So the practice itself may or may not be appropriate.
And again, that it depends, comes to the forefront once again. So that behaviour across the country of grassroots, the thousands of grassroots coaches up and down the country are dealing with a constraint that they have 3,600 seconds on an AstroTurf that they've paid X amount of money for, and there isn't a moment to lose. So that behaviour then becomes potentially difficult if we're looking at, well, how do you use that hour a week to maximise the learning? Coach in your situation has done it for a certain reason. If I was to pick that up as a novice coach and spend half of my time with players in a circle, I might actually be struggling to help the players to learn the game. Maybe because I didn't understand, like you were saying, the reason behind what that coach in question was doing it for.
But what are the kids there for? What is it you think you're trying to teach in these 3,600 seconds? Teach? Who says they want to be taught? It could just be that medium, that activity is giving them what they want for a period of time. You might want as a coach to do something else. Fine, but actually they're coming to be with their mates, have a bit of fun, and you know what? I want to try and develop that flick over somebody coming in, and I don't get practice in a real game or in a training session to do that, but I do get practice at it in a fun little mess around at the beginning. So this is back to what is effective coaching? What is an effective coaching session? It depends. Why are they coming? What level are they at? What are you trying to do with them? That's effective use of that 3,600 seconds, not a preconceived idea of, well, that's worked with elite level kids doing that. I want to get from A to B in this session, but the kids are all coming to your session. Some of them might have driven an hour and a half to get there. They need some time to warm up into the session.
I want to kind of pull this notion around philosophy and practice together. We've got some audience questions that have been sent in through Twitter that we'll get onto that are slightly off topic but still relevant nevertheless. Summarising all this, if you had a piece of advice or maybe one or two questions that a young novice or old novice coach might ask themselves to start this process off formalising or bringing together a coaching philosophy, what might that be?
I think that I would encourage any coach thinking about this to be thinking analytically about why they do what they do, and this is my inherent bias here due to my job, but also my particular way of thinking, to look at to look at the evidence base, to look for the evidence, and to say why should we do things in a particular way and what is effective. And because I think an awful lot of our industry is based in replication of others, but perhaps without a really good understanding of why. And I think we also still have, as I mentioned right at the beginning, a disposition to copy those who are, or to try and replicate the practice of those who are seemingly above or better than us. And I think that's quite a weak way to go about it, to be honest. I think if we're really thinking about developing your practice, then think about why you're doing what you're doing, to look for some really good quality evidence to underpin some of those decisions. And that can be quite difficult, and that can be really complex, because I think, as Andy said, the more you look for evidence, the more you'll realise, as you've just said, there's so much we don't know. And there is no evidence that would underpin a right way to do this. So I think to understand all the different ways that or lots of different ways that you could operate, and to understand the evidence underpinning them, for me that's crucial for developing practice as a coach.
The reason we're good working together is that is a really articulate answer. My answer is be yourself and consider the needs of the group that you've got.
Fantastic. Brilliant. Okay, I want to move on to the audience questions now that have been sent in to us. So we've got 4 to cover. And the questions are short, but your answers can be as detailed or as short as you like. So, Andy, I'm going to start with you. What have you changed your mind about in regards to your own coaching?
It's more about giving the players what they need, rather than a preconceived idea of this has got to meet my curriculum for this time of the year. Or so very much been, we've played a game at the weekend, this is how people have performed, this is what we need. I might have, when I'm very novice coach, gone, well, today's session's going to be about passing and dribbling and fitness and this, but it might not be what they need. So meeting more the needs of that group of players at that moment in time, I think that will be my emphasis there.
Same question, Don?
I've changed my mind in terms of I've learnt to need to get over my own ego and my own to get over my own ego, because there have been points, I guess, in my career, perhaps up till not too many years ago, which is embarrassing to think about, where I've taken some pretty dogmatic positions on stuff. I've made some absolutes, and I can remember. So only 5 years ago now, and I was very much a games-based advocate, still am, but I was dogmatic to the point of saying, this is it. You don't need games based. That's the way you should coach. And I went to Danny Kerry's, who's the women's GB hockey coach. He did a debrief workshop from the 2012 games, at which we'd won our first bronze medal for 20 years. And he's an inspirational figure in our sport, and is obviously a fantastic coach. And he said at that workshop, he said, I will never do another unopposed drill in my life, or activity in my life. And he said, and somebody asked him, I think something like, what advice would you give to up and coming coaches? He said the same. He said, never do an unopposed activity. And I was sat in the audience going, yeah, quite right, applauding loudly. I probably wasn't applauding, but in my mind I was thinking, yes, this is it, quite right. Then, just as I've changed in my perspective in that mind, to get rid of that dogmatic belief that I must be right in this philosophy. I still heavily believe in the value of context-led games-based practice, absolutely. But similarly, I went to observe a fantastic coach at one time. He was a rugby coach and a former Six Nations winning coach. So really, really fantastic. And he started, after the warm-up, his first meaningful activity was an unopposed racing game, essentially, with some passing and moves, and he'd call out the move, and the two teams would race each other to do it the quickest, etc. And I just interviewed him, and he'd just been talking about the value of games-based, context-led activity, of ensuring that, all of this kind of stuff. And I'm watching this, going, what's he doing? He's saying one thing and doing another, and it just became so evident from that activity for that group in that context at that time put them at a point where they were absolutely buzzing. They were loving it. They were competing. They were firing the ball around. And the rest of the session, to a certain extent, lived on the energy of that first activity. It absolutely it was perfect for them, and they loved it. They'd clearly done it lots of times before. It was one of the things that they did. It was chucking it down with rain. It was horrid, etc. The pitch was cutting up all over the place, but the guys absolutely loved it. And now I might come back and argue and say, well, clearly they're not going to be a better rugby team for being able to do those unopposed moves, etc. So I'd still argue that perhaps as a learning activity, it's suboptimal. That's a lovely word that lots of people are using at the moment. Love that. But as a coaching activity for that session, brilliant. Absolutely genius. And he then went on to do some really great stuff, which was hugely engaged with, clearly prepping for the Saturday's game, etc., that they were working towards, and it was brilliant. And it just reaffirmed for me the need, as Andy said, to ask that "it depends" question, to put the right activity in the right context at the right time for the right purpose for the right group. And there are many different ways to do things, and there are many different purposes for activities.
In answer to your simple question, what have you changed your mind about? Don's stories just reminded me. The amount of planning that you need to do to make a session look simple but really slick is actually masses and masses. So you do have to, as a coach, plan all of this to the nth detail. But the point I was maybe changed my mind about, but it's okay to change. So early in my coaching life, I might have gone, I've done all this planning, I've done all the things, this is the session I'm going to do for this group. I actually never felt the session. So I started it, I'm going to do A, B, C, then D, finish. Good session, well planned, on time, good use of my 360 minutes or however many seconds. But have the athletes got what they need? I think as I've gone on, what have I changed my mind about? It's okay to change. It's okay to not get everything done. It's okay to get to a certain point in a training session and go, that's enough, that's fine, done. Because the session's grown or evolved and gone with the session, as Don was saying, the flow to it's got exactly where the players need to be. So you might go, I'm cutting this short. That's done. That's enough for today. I can't replicate. I want them to leave the session like that. And on a different day, I need to do something else to make them leave the session. So I've changed my mind about maybe planning and how flexible I can be.
Next question. What's been the best investment that you've made in your own coaching? And while you think of the answer, I'll give you a quirky example from my own coaching. So the best investment that I have made in recent memory was a £6 pair of Apple headphones. I think other headphones are available, but the ones with the microphone on. And I coupled that with a tie clip and some masking tape. And the reason why that's the best investment I've made is it's a very simple way that I have been able to make my own lavalier mic that can plug into my phone, and I can record my sessions, other coaches' sessions on the voice notes. So for £6, I'm able to use that audio and potentially coupled with some video to look back and help the process of reflection. So what, Don, would you say is the best investment that you've made in your own coaching?
Well, a very deliberate purchase a couple of years ago was featured around. I have a real belief in the value of performance analysis, use of video, essentially, to help people learn. But I'm perhaps for years did exactly what everybody has to do or had to do when you get the video, i.e. you capture some video and then you lead your players sort of through some video footage, etc. And what I really wanted to do educationally was to get better athlete engagement and involvement in that analysis of video. So what I wanted ideally was to create some sort of subgroups in my team who would take responsibility to analyse particular aspects of our performance from, say, one week to the next, and how that would inform training. So we purchased a subscription to an online coaching platform called Coach Logic, which is actually quite popular particularly with rugby clubs, but growing more broadly than that as well. And actually it's a system they used at the West Ham Academy in football. And it just enables each athlete or small groups of athletes to watch something that you've prepared for them, and both to actively engage with that content, either to tag stuff on it or to write comments about it, and you can generate some conversation either online or use that as a mechanism to inform something else. So the best examples, I went and spoke to quite a few rugby clubs about how they did this, and the best examples I saw were, for example, there was a team that would look that were responsible for analysing the scrummaging at the weekend's games, and so the coach would clip up all the scrums, put them online, and one of the members of the scrummaging team would have responsibility each week for collating some feedback from everybody, having sort of watched it and analysed it, what's going on here, and their analysis of that would feed into the beginning of just a 15-minute video meeting before training each week. So they would have 2 minutes to give a summary of what they'd found. Coaches would then pick up on that and hopefully then go and try and apply that in the training that immediately followed. And I thought, so there's a lot of work involved with that essentially, but as a mechanism for getting groups of athletes to actively analyse what's going on and to perhaps come up with some things that they think were good and could be developed, that's been a really useful mechanism for that.
This is not the answer you're expecting, and I'm not even sure it's politically correct, and we might have to edit it. Great partner. Somebody that I can share as a coach, share my frustrations, my worries, my angst, and know that actually somebody understands what a coach is going through, and either I need to talk this through or actually I don't need to talk it through. So the best investment I've made, great partner who understands my world, because quite often as a novice coach or a really experienced coach, coaching can be very lonely, and actually you can be questioning yourself about many things. So the best investment in sharing on a broader sense a community of practice, but at a personal level a partner that you go, do you know what, I had a rubbish session today, I did this was wrong, and she's able to go, so it doesn't matter, or well, what would you do different, or so somebody who knows you and understands you as a coach in order to help you get through your day-by-day events as a coach.
Okay, what have you come across? Videos, books, articles, journals? What have you come across that's impacted you recently?
Well, obviously, our job, it involves reading stuff continuously, and just there's stuff coming out all of the time that's just fascinating. So there are so many things I could potentially share. I think for every coach, the best resource I've come across recently is Wade Gilbert's new book called Coaching Better Every Season, and for me it's a really good applicable resource material almost for any coach who has sort of a team or a group to work with, whether it be for one season or for multiple seasons. And the book is sort of structured around things you can do as a coach before a season, during a season, after a season, in order to make your coaching practice more effective from a multitude of perspectives. And it begins with these things about values, philosophy, culture, some of those things we've talked about. Gives some activities to do about how you could do that as a team or as a coaching team, and just has, I think, 12 chapters of different ways of applying that. So it's great because it's sort of theoretically informed, if you like. It's got a really good evidence base, but it's not hugely overt about that. Essentially gives lots of references to say, this is the underpinning, etc. But the application of the book is really practical. So I think it's a really nice balance between a really well-informed, evidence-based book, but that has a real sort of practical heart to it. And I'm really enjoying that at the moment. Sort of reading my way through that, thinking how this could greatly enhance my practice.
And given most of the time I'm trying to catch up with Don, I'm normally a couple of months behind. One of the best things I've come across is an interview script, a set of questions that Don and the colleagues did about interviewing coaches, about how did they learn, what made them better, and so on and so forth. So I'm sure we can get an appropriate link to the actual article, but it gives some very simple questions for coaches that they can reflect on and ask other coaches about, that makes you think about learning and developing and your day-to-day growth as a coach.
Fantastic. And what we'll do is we'll link those both those resources up in the show notes, so the coaches just tap on the player, they should find the links to those. Last one, I think we might have touched on it as we've gone on through this conversation, but what advice would you have given yourself when you were first starting out? So if you could go back in the time machine, you meet yourself when you first start coaching, what advice would you say to yourself?
Yeah, I think we have touched upon this, but for me, I'd be telling myself, get over yourself, get over your own ego, recognise that you're not pursuing the right way to do this, because you'll never get there, and actually that doesn't exist. It's a rubbish question, and recognise that therefore this is the start of a lifelong learning journey. So I heartily believe that I'll be learning to coach until I quit coaching, essentially, and you'll never get to the end or the right way of doing it, because that journey is going to be unique and bespoke, recognise that there are many other people out there who are undergoing their own journeys, who'll go on a different pathway from you, will believe slightly different things, but they are just as valuable, just as informed, and just as expert as you might be in what they believe and how they think.
Again, agreeing with Don. Be yourself. The advice I would give starting out, be yourself as a coach. Expect to make loads of mistakes and enjoy making those mistakes, because you'll learn from them. So take the fear out of, you've got to do it this way. Go with what you think is best on any session, on any given day, on any given month. Do what you think is best for the group that you've got, and don't worry about making mistakes.
Don, Andy, can't thank you enough for this. Where might coaches be able to find out a little bit more about your work, or even connect with you?
Well, they could all the usual social media mechanisms. Twitter is probably best for me, so very happy there. But also, obviously, as part of our work, just at the university, we have a sort of outward-facing web page that you can go to. So for either of us, you can search for our name and then put in University of Worcester into the Google or whatever search engine you use. And that will take you to our homepage. So there, and that tells us a little bit more about us and gives you the contact details to get in touch. And we'll sort of give some links to the things that we write about and the things that we have sort of put out there in the world. That's probably a good mechanism. Very happy always to receive communication from people who want to talk about coaching.
Not being Twitter related, not being social media navvy, I'd have to stick with email to the university here at the University of Worcester, and myself and Don would link and get back to you with any question we can help with.
Brilliant. Dr. Don Vinson, Dr. Andy Cale, this has been an amazing couple of hours that we've spent. I've learned so much. I hope the guys listening in on the podcast have too. And I look forward to hopefully getting you on for another round 2 at some point in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please help spread the word or leave us a review on iTunes. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this episode. You can reach me on Twitter @JackWalton1. And don't forget to follow Liverpool FA @Liverpool_CFA. See you next time.